Thank you very much. And in fact, I was fortunate and honored to have been the co-facilitator of a recent informal dialogue on operationalizing the platform on Indigenous peoples and local communities, which was hosted by Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as the 6 national Indigenous peoples organizations in Canada. And what Hindu has just stated is echoed in the documents that were, or at least I should say maybe more specifically, the points of convergence as far as operationalizing the platform. I just want to offer a few closing remarks to this important panel about the intersection between Indigenous knowledge and the issue of climate change. 40 years ago, in June of 1977 in Barrow, Alaska, at the opening of the first organizing meeting of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Eben Hobson, the late Eben Hobson, who is regarded and recognized as the founder of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, stated, "Our language contains the memory of 4,000 years of human survival through the conservation and good managing of our Arctic wealth. Our language contains the intricate knowledge of the ice that we have seen no others demonstrate." This is a very important quote. If you think about what he's referencing, the cultural heritage, the Indigenous knowledge, the profound relationship that Inuit and other Indigenous peoples have to their lands, territories, and resources. Again, it speaks volumes about the place and the status as well as the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I think that in the context of climate change, Indigenous peoples have the most to lose. The adverse impacts of climate change, Indigenous peoples have the most to lose. But they also have the most to offer on the basis of their Indigenous knowledge, and especially about sustainability. And sustainability of the Arctic as a region, but also in other regions of the world. And in fact, the references to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are directly relevant to this discussion. And Hindu has pointed out the role of rights of Indigenous peoples, especially in the context of the Paris Agreement. And indeed, on the first day, the plenary session, the opening session, nearly every, in fact, I think every world leader, every leader from diverse backgrounds and countries underscored the importance and the role of Indigenous peoples. And I think here, the key message that I want to underscore is that with the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there are now important obligations of every government. So those of you in the room who represent a government, your colleagues, your peers, your counterparts, in the context of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, have pledged to uphold the minimum standards for the well-being, the dignity, and the survival of Indigenous peoples. And so with this understanding of your obligations, which have been affirmed in the UN Charter, but more explicitly in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you have to think about how it is that you're actually going to contribute to the implementation of the rights affirmed in the UN Declaration. We greatly appreciate the comments that were made by world leaders on the opening day in the plenary session, the important references, even as late as yesterday's presentation by Minister Bennett, for example. But I think the real challenge is next year, when you return to the Arctic Circle, don't just reference Indigenous peoples. Tell us what actions you've actively taken to implement the rights affirmed in the UN Declaration? And there are ways in which you can do so. I mean, those countries that are keen to explore and consider their obligations in relation to the IMO Polar Code in the context of Arctic shipping. Well, if you've gone to great lengths to inform and educate yourself about your responsibilities to the IMO Polar Code, likewise, you can do the same in relation to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. How are your shipping activities going to impact the marine mammals that Indigenous peoples throughout the Arctic coastal region who rely upon those marine mammals? This is just one example. I think there are a range of other examples that could probably be articulated by our panel members here about how do you actively implement in your own respective countries, even if there are no Indigenous peoples present within your country. Many of you, there are Indigenous peoples present within your respective states. Indigenous homelands are, as we've already heard, throughout especially the Pacific and elsewhere, are the territories that we're sharing in common. Article 31 in particular of the UN Declaration affirms that Indigenous peoples have the right to their cultural heritage and their traditional knowledge, but it also creates an obligation or responsibility on the part of states to take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights. Article 32 affirms the right of Indigenous peoples to determine their own priorities for development, but also significantly another provision which requires that if states are going to undertake actions, legislative or administrative actions that may impact the lands, territories, or resources of Indigenous peoples, that they have to gain the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned. And these are weighty obligations, and if we think about it not only in the Arctic, but globally, inform yourselves, educate yourselves, and hopefully come back to us next year here at the Arctic Circle and tell us what you have proactively done to be responsive to the aspirations of Indigenous peoples, but more significantly, the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I think, for the most part, in some areas it may be difficult, it may be contentious, but if you do it the right way, it'll actually make you feel good about what you're doing, because it's not only beneficial to Indigenous peoples, it's beneficial to all of humankind. So think about these matters, and I want to close with two announcements. The first announcement is that the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change would like to invite government representatives present here at Arctic Circle to an informal meeting immediately after this session in the room Stemma, and I know that Hindu and Minnie Degawan will also be there and present. My final announcement is for all the Inuk in the room, any Inuk person, all the Inuit who are present here at Arctic Circle. We're having a very informal meeting just outside of UIC's designated room downstairs on the first floor, so the windows in the corner. And I just offer this as a way for us to meet and greet one another here in the context of the Arctic Circle and before we all go back to our respective homelands. There's been some discussion of football and the results of recent football. I just simply want to say on a personal level, I think it, for other Arctic Indigenous peoples here, we're more into ice hockey. So on behalf of the panel members. I'd like to express my thanks as well to everybody and for also the interest that has been generated on this important discussion. Qiyanak.